Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of The Free Agent. I've got James Phillips here. James, thanks so much for joining.
Oh, not a problem. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, so interesting background, interesting topic. So you've spent basically a long time in tech, starting as a database administrator, moving to the development side, touching BI, which is business intelligence people, then running large-scale engineering teams, and then most recently CTO, then CIO at Rev.io. Now you've got your own AI consultancy where your goal is to help companies design, implement, and improve their AI capabilities. Man, thanks so much for joining. Really appreciate it.
Oh, no, not a problem. And yeah, that's a pretty good summary there. So
I
don't think I
try
could have
to
done it better myself.
try
So
to do my due diligence here. I'll send it to you at the after the call. But listen, AI is real top of mind to literally everybody that I speak to. A lot of it is just kind of high level. What is AI? And I feel like a lot of folks actually have kind of this analysis paralysis. And so they basically just don't do anything because they're too afraid to kind of like attack it and try to understand it at a fundamental level. And that's why you're here. So I think first question is, how long have you been around AI, which obviously is a recent concept, but talk to us a
well,
little bit about your journey.
it depends on how you define AI. I guess that is the question, right? My very first, I guess, what you would kind of call AI project was about 22, 23 years ago. Um, very early on, simple machine learning type of stuff that I worked on. So I've been in and around the space around AI for quite a long time. Obviously, it's become the buzzword more recently, though, and what everybody's talking about, and a lot of people forget that what it is exactly and how long it's really been around. It has evolved a lot. There's no question about that. When I first started with it, I think there was about two algorithm options you could use, and that was pretty much it. So nothing compared to where it is today, that's for sure, and nowhere near the horsepower available to run the simple things like we used to run 20 plus years ago. It would take like a day, and on
Right.
modern hardware now, I bet it would take probably minutes to actually probably complete.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that AI is a buzzword, which I totally agree. And I feel like the space that I'm in, fractional executive, recruiting is also now a huge buzzword. So I can relate there. But I think starting at the very fundamental level, what is your definition of AI?
So I try to break it down to be very simple, and so by doing that, I put it into three different pillars. I put it into automation, I put it into predictive, and then generative. And I think by placing it into those three buckets, that's a very good starting point for when you're going down your journey trying to figure out what AI is, because each one of those buckets, then you can go down a rabbit's hole and spend hours, days, weeks trying to learn and figure out each one of them. But I think if you understand at the very beginning that those buckets exist and each one of them has been around for different periods of time, like the automation type of stuff, you're talking 10 plus years around some of that stuff. And it's something as simple as, this is an example I love to give people, is when you are driving your car, right? A lot of newer cars now have the self-applying brakes, right? That's what we would call AI automation. And the reason is it's because it's based upon a set circumstance and then automating and doing something, right? It's got all these sensors on your car and it's going, oh, you're traveling at X speed, your closing distance between the car in front of you is X. We got to apply the brakes, otherwise you're going to hit it, right?
Mm.
And so and that's been around a long time. I mean, self-applying brakes is at least been 10 years in cars, if not longer at this point. Um, in understanding that, where then the predictive bucket is at a very high level, is that's all about taking the history that we have and all the data and predicting kind of what is next, so to speak. But what I like to say about that is it's factual. It's based on your data. It doesn't make up anything new. It doesn't, come up with something new and pretend that something new exists. It just looks at what you already have and then kind of says, oh, well, based on that, I'm predicting this is the answer, right?
Hmm.
Versus generative, which starts with data, but ultimately then generates something new based on data that already existed.
Man, so that's really interesting. And I haven't heard it kind of bucketized into automation, predictive, and generative. I mean, generally generative, I feel like that's the AI buzzword that's popping around left and right, and most people don't know what that actually is. But super, super interesting there. And so I think that's a good segue into, can you kind of like help demystify what's the difference between like AI and actually machine learning? Because I feel like those words are actually being used interchangeably, and I
So
don't know.
they're not. The best way I like to explain that is they're not interchangeable, but what they are is they're part. So machine learning is part of what is now the modern day AI umbrella. And that's how you kind of want to think of it. You can't have AI without machine learning. Because underneath the covers of all of this stuff today, what it might look like in the future may be a little bit different, but today is various different machine learning algorithms that are, some of them 10 years old, some of them 10 days old at this point in time, right? Things are moving very, very fast in this space, but it's one of the foundational pieces, that along with the data portion of it, and then ultimately some of the applications and the hardware and everything else that kind of all sits on as part of the overall solution. But machine learning is just part of the AI solution. And I think when people start to realize that, because I've seen a lot of different things out there that have tried to segregate them and say that machine learning is here and AI is over here, and it's like, well, not really, at least not in my mind at all. It's AI to me is this overarching umbrella. At least I will say this, and how it's being defined today.
Got it.
You know, some people say, well, even AIs that's being business defined today isn't truly AI. You'll see a lot of that out there because they'll be like, no, AI should be like, the future of when, robots are doing everything for us and we're just sitting around on our couch all day
That's
long.
how I think of it. Just for the record.
So, but business AI today and how it's being defined, going back to what I said before, those three different pillars, right? That's really what business AI is today. And machine learning is just a portion of it. There's nothing that I have seen that's currently being done in that space that ML is not part of it somewhere.
Understood. And I think that's a good segue onto like, how does it actually work? I mean, you kind of gave a little bit of a little insight when you were talking about the three different buckets, but I mean, is it just massive data sets with data scientists that are basically trying to kind of render like some sort of scenario in the future? So a company or a car, that's a great example, knows how to react properly. Like, how does it actually do what it does?
Oh boy. Well, we could sit here for hours talking about all this and get a little crazy, but um, in a best summarized nutshell of how I can kind of put this together is it is data first, and that's how it is in my mind, right? Because to do any of the what is out there, there's data that's part of it, right? I've had somebody ask me one day, they were like, well, isn't AI just easy, right? Like, I take my phone, I point it and I had a picture of a wine bottle and it tells me what bottle of wine it is, right? And it's like, well, AI just did that automatically, right? It's like, no, thousands, if not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of images were uploaded, verified, tagged, labeled to all of this so that you can now just point your camera at something and then it's going to tell you what it is. But there's there's a mix of things that come together. There's the data aspect of it, and depending on what you're doing is going to depend on what type of data, right? Whether you're trying to do contextual, where you're trying to do images, whatever you're trying to do, there's different types of data that's going to be part of this, right? Then that data has to be, what I like to say, made AI ready, right? So, meaning that not all data as it exists in most organizations today is AI ready. In general, you want your data in some sort of data lake. Because from there, it's one of the easiest ways to get it AI ready. And what do I mean by AI ready is the most acceptable version of what happens there today is the data gets what we call vectorized. And at a very high level, what that means is that we are taking the data and we're putting it into a different format that allows basically cross sections of data to be applied to each other. It allows similarities to be more easily found within data, whether that be textual data, whether that be image data, whatever it is. This concept of vectoring the data allows you to then take it and figure out where does the data cross section each other, for lack of better words.
Hmm.
Allows and supports things like contextual searching, meaning that you're able to search the data and I can say one phrase and it knows that it is other things, and it also will know it is other things in different languages, right? So I could say, I can have a picture of a cat. And traditional searches, if you search for cat, you're going to get a cat, right?
Right.
But sometimes if you search for feline, maybe you get a cat, maybe you don't, right? If you put in the Spanish word or the French word or the Russian word, all these different words, now it's going to get further apart from each other. But through this concept of vectorizing, and as well as some of the algorithms that are out there, it knows how to do contextual searching now. And it knows that different words mean the same thing, and it then allows you to find the appropriate results for it. So that's one portion, one part of it. Then there's the machine learning and the algorithms and everything else to sit on. And what I like to equate that to is business use cases.
Mm-hmm.
Your machine learning algorithms are designed to solve specific use cases. So for example, when I go out to ChatGPT, right, and I say, generate me an image that, of X, right? And it goes through and it generates gives you a few options, like which ones do you like and everything. Well, that's one algorithm that's doing that work that's underneath it. And for simplicity reasons, we'll call it one algorithm, right? Compared to if I say, generate me a PowerPoint presentation that is about X. That's
Mm-hmm.
a different algorithm, right? Because it's a different business use case and a different result that is being put out there.
Sure.
Now, what happens is, in a lot of cases, is businesses are able to share some of these algorithms because of the fact that let's face it, a lot of businesses are trying to do a lot of the same things, right? And so because of that, in those cases, that's where off-the-shelf products and things along those lines can come very useful when the use case fits it.
Right.
However, when the
There's a
use
common
case,
problem between, specific
but when it doesn't fit it, that is when you got to go and create a new algorithm to support what you are trying to do. You might be able to leverage something that somebody started already and take pieces of it, but you're maybe having to add to it or subtract from it depending on what ultimately you were trying to do there. Um, so a very, very, and then the other really big part of it, and why I think has become so big over the last couple of years, is the advancement in the hardware side of the things. It's a big play into this. So the new GPU processing and everything else, and that has been coming out, and companies like Nvidia and Intel and AMD are investing crazy money into it. That is what has enabled all of this stuff to start happening at speeds that just weren't previously possible. So when you take all of these factors together, that's what kind of how all this works. And on top of it, it is what has led to this kind of revolution that we're seeing in this space,
Right.
and we'll continue to see as all of these tiers advance too, as the data tier advances, as the algorithms advance, as the hardware advances. That's how you're gonna keep seeing the shift each time the next versions of these come out. And
Interesting.
we're seeing it with like I know it's still in beta, but with OpenAI's O1 model that came out, a few weeks ago now at this point, right? There was a lot of new stuff that was enabled in that model and new algorithms that allowed it to do some things that previously weren't available. And that's what we're just going to keep seeing, is that evolution, and let's face it, and fixing the broken stuff too, right? People are going to nitpick, you know, like when O1 came out, which was codenamed Strawberry, right? And people were asking it how many R's are in Strawberry, and was giving like the wrong answer at certain points in
Sure.
times, right? It's like, but then again, you're using it for something it wasn't meant. It wasn't built to answer the question of how many R's are in strawberry.
Right.
The O1 model was built to do was to start doing some self-learning and self-healing around things. So when it made a mistake, it could actually move beyond that mistake and make a correction.
Sure. Well, I think that also ties back to the data first component, making sure the data is sanitized. And I like the word vectorized. Never heard of that. And for the record, there are 3 R's in strawberry. Is that correct?
You're
Right?
talking to a person that really struggled with English class, so I'm not the one to ask that question.
Got it. Got it. I think that's a good segue. You kind of touched on this a little bit, but like, how are some companies leveraging AI currently? Like, what are some use cases? I mean, obviously, chatbots, which we've had a
Yeah.
conversation about chatbots, which I think is really interesting, a few weeks back. But outside of chatbots, and maybe talk a little bit about that. But what are some other ways that companies are using AI and some different use cases that you're seeing pop up?
Well, I think there's the common use cases, right? And that is where you're seeing chatbots, things like, let's just call them customer service aides or co-pilots or whatever term you want to kind of put to that. But it's also becoming more prevalent in the software development space now. A lot of tools are advancing in that area. So software development, from the engineers actually writing code, QA, unit testing, that's a big area that's come a long way in the last 6 months. Matter of fact, I was working on something yesterday, and I'm using a add-in that I have been playing around with a while. It's something called Codium. And as I was designing a data a layer, and I was doing something where I was designing something around a person profile, right? And as I'm designing this, it just started suggesting to me, like, oh, it looks like you're trying to design a table around a person. Would you like to add first name, last name, address, like all these fields? Like, it was just like, would you like to add all this? I was
Sure.
like, actually, yes, that just saved me like 10 minutes of typing out all of this.
Wow.
So there's a lot of stuff that's starting to make and these tools are coming a long way. And there's more data that's being fed in. They're
Right.
fine tuning the models, right? And they're getting things to be more accurate. So like software development, as I said, it's starting to do things like code completion, things like that. QA, it's starting to advance in that area to be able to automate a lot of the QA, and not just automate the running of the QA, but also find new QA tests that need to be performed and actually build those in. And there's different tools are taking different approaches in that space.
Actually improving the process too, which is crazy.
Yeah, and so there's some tools out there that, like, for example, if you have a web application, it looks at your web logs and looks at user trending inside of your application, or what users are actually doing, and builds new QA tests based off of that.
That's interesting in a use case as well that I've noticed is that I use ChatGPT. I've used it for writing some, and it's still just too robotic for my like personally. But you can put in information and it can find commonalities that like I just am incapable of doing.
Yeah.
Right? It's really 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 interesting. I know a lot of folks, particularly in the marketing side of the house now, are leveraging it for content creation, which is also led to this explosion of content. But I think that leads to kind of an interesting point going back to the data, because I've used ChatGPT where like maybe I'm researching a topic, and I'm asking it, what percent of X is going on here, and it gives you this information, but then it's like, what's the source of truth? You know what I mean? Like if people are just inputting poor information, then the AI is just going to spit the same information out to me, and that's where I get a bit concerned about leveraging like data and percentage and stuff like that. Talk to us a little bit
Well,
about.
yeah, I mean, so I'll go into that, and I also want to wrap up the previous question a little bit too, with some other things too. Like product design is another big thing where we're seeing a lot of stuff come up. There's tools out there that are doing full UI creation now, where you just say, I want to create a UI that looks like this and does this, and it's just creates it.
Wow.
So some tools coming out. There's a lot of tooling in that space that is starting to pop up. And then just companies that are then deciding they have their own use cases. And so they're starting to put dollars into building their own algorithms and models and things along those lines, because they're like, we have something that we either A, need internally for our company,
Yeah.
or they have an application that they sell and they're like, well, we want to put AI in our application to do X, and that X is nothing that's off the shelf available. So therefore, they're investing the dollars to say, okay, well, we're going to actually have to build this and put this together.
That's interesting. And that's also where I've seen a lot of funding going the last kind of year and a half to 2 years, was like any company that has their own proprietary AI solution generally. Of course, maybe they put a wrapper around ChatGPT or whatever, but they've got their own specific use case and they're leveraging AI to solve for that problem. And that seems to be of high interest to most investors currently that are.
And then to answer the other question you had out there on the data and everything else is that yeah, it is all about the data, and you need to be very cognizant of where the data is coming from. And, you know, with some of the newer models that have been coming out, especially on the chat GPT side, right? You get into the 4 and the 4 turbos and things along those lines that are out there. One of the interesting trends that I have seen is that, so if you think about, especially when like it originally came out, the 3.5 models and things along those lines, right? It was all about data that was already done, trained in the large language models, and that's why the age-old thing used to be, well, go out there and ask it if Queen Elizabeth is still alive, and it said yes, because it wasn't feeding new data in on a regular basis, right? It was coming off of a trained static model from a certain date. Well, things have been moving more towards things being very real time or near real time, and this is where, if you are using these tools, especially off-the-shelf tools, you need to be very cognizant of the source. Now, one thing I will give especially ChatGPT credit for is if you scroll all the way to the bottom, you're going to see all the little footnotes to tell you where the data came from.
I didn't know that. Thank you. That's a pro tip for me. I appreciate that.
And you'll want to click on some of those sometimes because they have, let's call it whitelisted, for lack of better words, some areas that they just have a high confidence level in that they should be good sources of truth. But I've seen it backfire. And so, especially in an area I saw it backfire was, it was in the technical space. There are some areas that have been considered, whether it's some blog areas or some centralized blogs that have been around for a really long time, that they kind of like, oh, this is the source of truth. Well, I saw an article, this was a couple months ago, that came out, and the article was bad. Let's just leave it at that. There was things in there that just were not right, but it was posted on what was considered a trusted site. And so if you went into ChatGPT and asked it a question, it was referencing that article in its answer. And if you went down to the footnotes and you saw it and you clicked through, you would see it would bring that article up.
Yeah.
And that article had information in it that wasn't correct. So you do want to be cognizant. You do want to pay attention to those footnotes and look at those things. If you are using things more just internally, even in your own company, you have to be very cognizant of, is the data you're feeding it been cleansed? Is it clean? Is it data that's actually accurate? One horror story, somewhat, that I can tell here when it comes to this one. So it was a company putting up a chatbot, and they were using their internal customer service ticketing system to feed it. Well, they were using a tool called Zendesk, very popular in that space, right? But Zendesk has this concept of, when you are working a ticket, of external notes and internal notes. External notes are seen by the person who opened the ticket and external people outside your company. Internal notes are only seen internally, right? Well, sometimes internal notes, let's face it, in certain companies get a little loose in what people might type in there.
Sure.
Well, they fed this data into an off-the-shelf product to do a chatbot. They forgot to filter the internal notes out. So somebody went on their website, asked a question about how to do something, and the chatbot responded, well, you must be an effing idiot. The reason being, there was an internal note on a ticket that matched that use case.
Oh, wow.
That called the customer an effing idiot because they didn't understand it.
Unbelievable.
So you got to be careful, no matter what you're doing, about ultimately the data and the data you're feeding it.
I think that again, I feel like there's a common theme here, and it's the data, the data, the data, which I appreciate. And clearly, with that use case or horror story, I guess, for the company, making sure you have sanitized data is important. I think it's a good segue into like potential ethical impacts of AI and potential risks. You just highlighted a potential
Yep.
risk. What else do you see in that regard, and maybe some ethical impacts that that
Well,
folks?
yeah, ethical AI is something that's kind of really been top of mind for me for especially after the new O1 model came out. And I saw some of the ways it was already being used and tested, and some people were lauding it, and I looked at it and it was like, I'm lauding its capabilities, but it's crossing a very interesting ethical boundary. Um, to me, it's become very powerful, and let's just face it, bad actors are always going to be ahead of the bad's going to figure out how to use this before the good does. And that has been proven over and over inside of technology for 20, 30 years, or who knows, even maybe longer than that at this point. Um, and because of that, I know OpenAI obviously is trying to generate revenue and money and everything else and all these things. But to me, there's an ethical question starting to surface inside of there of who gets access to this. I know it's been kind of like, nope, the whole world gets access to it and everything else, and that's our model, right? But if you follow that, I can almost guarantee we are going to see some crazy AI driven data breaches that are going to occur because of it. Because they're going to figure out how to use it first
Right.
before basically security vendors can figure out how to stop it. They're just going to outpace it. It's just the nature of how that is going to work. So there's a big ethical question inside of there. There's other ethical questions inside of AI, especially around disclosing, are you actually talking to a real human or not, and things along those lines. There's going to be a ton of regulation that I see coming out inside of this space. EU will lead the way, as EU always does. That's just the nature of how this beast works. And then the US, I implore that we figure something out at a much more broader level than each individual state doing something one off on their own, because honestly, that's where almost all of our regulation has occurred,
Yeah.
around privacy and everything else, and it makes the management of it and the compliance to it from a business and technology side very difficult. But there is ethical questions. Like, I have started to see, like, there is now AI video interviews going on where it's not even a real person. It is a
I just
somebody took somebody's
yeah.
image and it looks like a real person. It is not a real person interviewing you. It
Yeah.
is they're going through scripted questions basically and asking them to you.
Yeah, I know some folks that use it on the marketing side for videos where it's literally fake people, it's AI generated people and content and production quality that's actually pretty high. Super interesting point though about the data breach side, and that's something I hadn't thought about directly. But when I use AI, I don't put any personal information in it. The data I generally use is clean and sanitized, but I would imagine there's got to be a plethora of people, employees within companies that are taking confidential internal information and putting it in a chat GPT, like an email. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I know a lot of folks use it for email creation, and I could see that being huge. And to your point, I didn't think about it in that regard, but that could be huge opportunity
Yeah,
for
if a
thieves.
company is going to allow AI in their organization in any way, and whether
Yeah.
they're doing ChatGPT, Copilot, or something else, it doesn't really matter. You've got to have policies in place
Yeah.
nowadays about how to use it, what can be used, what you can use it for, what you can't use it for, understand, and, or some cases just say flat out. I'm sure in a lot of businesses that want to keep certain things confidential, not even risk it, just flat out say, you have to use X version, which keeps the data private and doesn't share it.
Yeah. No, I think that's some sage advice, and that's pretty terrifying again when you kind of think through the possibilities here and what information people could be sharing because they don't care or they're just ignorant as to kind of where this information is going. Because the information is going from your computer into, some repository where it is stored forever, for good or for bad, right?
Yeah, depending on what you're using, but yes, and in one way or another, I mean, and even when you're using or implementing third-party products, like reviewing their privacy statements and everything else, and on their data privacy statements, it just has to be part of the due diligence process. You need to understand where your data is going, and if they're vague, you need to either dive in deeper and get better answers. And if they won't give them to you, there's certain things you just got to be like, we can't use this because of that. Like they're very, I've seen some privacy statements from some AI companies that are really vague about where the data goes.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm just like, yeah, you cannot approve that inside of any company that actually cares about, its data and where it's ultimately landing and going.
That's a huge business too, obviously. Huge. The data brokers, I mean, it's just it's crazy. But so probably a more fun question, and just a couple more for you, James. Really appreciate your time. So where do you see the industry going in the next 3 to 5 years? And I didn't realize it's a loaded question because it could go anywhere. But like, where do you see it going, and what excites you the most?
Um, oh gosh, it is. So I do see it advancing quite a bit. As I said, hardware is going to be a big part of it. How much the hardware advances and how also small they can get the hardware is also going to extremely drive where it ultimately goes, right? Right now, right, to do a lot of the processing, you're in big data centers, and that's where the hardware exists. We're just seeing now AI enhanced laptops and stuff come out, right? But that's still
Yeah.
medium factor type of stuff, right? If they can get some of this technology down to be more microchipped IoT type of base type of things, I think the possibilities get near endless at that point.
You're talking about like components, maybe like components of a computer, just everything shrinking down where you can have more.
Well, yeah, because the more it shrinks, then the more you can get like AI like enabled things into farming and stuff like that, for example, right? Irrigation around farming and things along those lines. Right now, there's a lot of technology in that space, but it's mostly based around sensors in fields that communicate back on like wireless back, and it still feeds data back somewhere. Well, imagine all of that could happen at like the at a sprinkler head, type of nano type of thing, where the sprinkler head can figure out on its own if it needs to turn itself on or not, right?
That
So that's what I mean by the factor and how much like some of the power behind this can be shrunk into smaller sizes and be able to be and where that advances, I think is going to drive a lot of where the industry ultimately goes, and at least as far as in manufacturing and in the farming and agriculture and things along those lines, right? And where ultimately that drives to. Outside of that, I do think where you're going to see a lot of stuff coming is as these algorithms start to advance into doing a lot of self-correcting. I think that's the next evolution point that's gonna hit, right? Is that like what happens today, right? You put something in, you get a result, and yeah, you can play the game of like you ask it a question back of like, wait, you're saying this, is that really right? And then sometimes even when you do that, it will be like, oh, I'm sorry, I made a misstatement and things like that. You can but imagine getting it so it just starts doing that on its own and becoming self-discovery. I do think that's one of the next bigger advancements that we're going to see over the next 12 months, let's call it. I think that we're going to see a lot of stuff starting to pop up in that area. We're starting to see it a little bit already. Some of the very advanced companies, OpenAI is doing some stuff in that area already. But the other thing that's ultimately going to control this, and I talked a little bit about before, is regulation.
right.
Where does regulation land around this? And will they overregulate it, which will stifle it? Will they underregulate it, which then you kind of get into some of that ethical type of side of things and basically asking companies to self-govern themselves from an ethical standpoint? That's the really big thing. And because so much of that's up in the air, it's a little hard to figure out what really is next. I mean, you've seen some reports come out that it keeps growing on every report I see of the percent of like Fortune 100 and 1000 companies that are budgeting for next year for AI regulation. I know when the report first came out, it was like in the 30s. The last report I saw, I think we're up over 50% of companies now that are starting to put budget in for AI regulation for the 2025 or their next fiscal year. And I think a lot of it is because they all see the writing on the wall that it's coming.
Right.
But what it's going to be and what it's ultimately going to land as, my guess is it's going to start with a lot of disclaimer type of stuff. Like you're going to have to tell people if they're really talking to a real person or not. I think that's some of the initial stuff that comes out. I think from there, you're going to see regulations step up on like what's allowed to be this, I like stock market, for example. I think there's going to be a lot of regulation about what's allowed to be decisioned and what's not allowed to be decisioned on an automatic basis through, AI engines and things along those lines. So each industry is just going to be interesting to see where it leads to because, lending decisions and things along those lines. Well, AI deciding lending decisions, there's some discriminatory things that could possibly get played into. So I think there's a lot of stuff that it's just so up in the air. It's a little hard to figure out, like, is it going to stifle it or is it going to help advance it? And what those laws and regulations do are really going to drive a lot of that.
Yeah, it definitely is going to be interesting. I think that's a good segue to the last question because a lot of companies are trying to figure out like where do I start? And so obviously you're an AI practitioner, but like where should a company really start? Should they go hire a fractional AI person? Should they bring that in-house? Should they hire a consultant? And granted, I realize the answer is going to be it depends. But where is a good starting point? Because a lot of folks are just trying to kick the tires and trying to understand implications. Like how is this going to impact my business?
Well, I think the first thing is you got to get off the AI bandwagon, and take a step back and learn what AI is. And I would implore any executive team to actually learn what AI actually is, and at least at like that 10,000 foot level of like what it is, what's kind of possible, right? Because you need to know that first to even figure out does it apply to your business. Like just jumping on the bandwagon to say, well, AI is the next thing, and if we don't do it, we're going to be dead as a company.
Right.
Well,
But those conversations are happening though. You know
they
what I mean?
are, but the question then, you're starting to see this is companies that have made those statements and started to invest dollars and whether that's hard dollars or people dollars or soft dollars type of thing, but they're invested into it and they're all coming back going, well, we're not getting our ROI. Like, and you're starting to see some of these doom and gloom statements around AI and everything else. But what you're going to find out is that they were just kind of wandering lost in the woods and not really knowing even where they were trying to go, no compass or anything, and just saying AI, we have to use it because that's what our board of directors told us, right? And they didn't stop to take the time out to figure out, okay, but how does it actually apply? And then follow standard business practices that have been around for long enough now to say, is there an ROI there for us in this project?
Right.
Or are we just doing it to say we're going to do it, and in the end, it's going to end up costing us so much more money than what we're ever going to end up making from it? And that's why I think you're starting to see a lot of people get a little doom and gloomy about AI right now. There's certainly there's a lot of positive. There's also a lot of negative out there right now, and most of the negative is stemming from people that jumped in and just said, tried to do things and tried to use it in ways it was never meant for either. I had a almost 2 hour conversation last week with somebody, and that was our whole conversation was all around, well, it just doesn't work. And I was like, well, tell me why it doesn't work. And they went through all these things. And I was like, that's because you didn't use it right.
Right. It sounds like it shouldn't work.
You're right. For that and what you're trying to do, it will not work in its current state. And walk people through like, all right, what are you trying to do? What's your goal as a business? Where are you trying to get to? And then just try to figure out, okay, how does AI apply there? And in some cases, the answer might be it doesn't.
Yeah.
There's that is a valid answer that it may not apply.
Yeah. And I tend to agree with you. I feel like far too many people are like, I've got to use it, especially at the board level, right? What's this AI stuff? A bunch of guys sitting around pontificating on the business's future. But I agree with the kind of like a fundamental level. Does it affect our industry? Is there a way we can leverage it? Should we invest dollars into it or not? And again, I think a great use case for a fractional AI practitioner could be walking with a company down that path,
Yeah.
being a founding board and helping them try to figure out if it's worth the investment, if it's not. And I'm sure that can be done for a pretty small engagement amount.
I
So
mean, definitely, and personally, that's just kind of how I focus on things. Is more in that area. It's like my whole goal is to figure out what are you trying to do,
yeah,
and
yeah,
then we try. Then once I know that, then I can start figuring out. Well, is there an AI use case there or not? And even if there is a use case there, is there one that actually has a positive return on investment for you?
right. Which is very important. Well, James, really appreciate it. You got me terrified though of like the self-correcting behavior with AI. Like I immediately started thinking of Skynet and the T1000 and just the whole world on fire. But really appreciate the time today. Where can folks find you?
You can find me on sapcg.co, or you can find it sapcg on LinkedIn as well.
Cool. And we'll add that to the notes as well and put a link in the video. Man, really appreciate the time and you sharing your brain with us for a little while.
Oh, not a problem. Thanks, Beau.
Awesome.